Okay, welcome back to the other part of chapter 4, right? And the last time we left chapter 4, we've been looking at gross domestic product, and we said gross domestic product basically is linked with income and expenditure, right? So income, we said, is equal to expenditure when we're looking at gross domestic product, or we're looking at the GDP for a specific country, okay? In that sense, we can actually calculate gross domestic product using what we call the expenditure approach, okay? So that is what we're going to be doing today in the video, and we'll look at other key things as well, okay? So the expenditure approach, basically, remember we said income equals GDP and also equals expenditure, right? So basically what you earn is what you end up spending, right? So the total expenditure on final goods and services equals GDP as well. It's basically an identity equation, okay? So that is what we can conclude, okay? So in that sense, we can say that GDP equals consumption. So this C is consumption. All right, so consumption. Okay, this I is investment. The G is basically government purchases or government expenditure. And then we have XM, which is basically net exports. Okay, so in the United States, for example, trying to calculate GDP, we use what we call the expenditure approach. So we add consumption expenditure, investment expenditure, government expenditure, and basically net exports. The reason we actually subtracted M from it is, remember, GDP is only looking at goods and services produced within a country, right? So given this equation, we can actually calculate GDP for any country. And remember, we said GDP equals income, and we said income is basically denoted by Y in macroeconomics. Okay, so this is income, and there's also expenditure. Okay, and there's also GDP. Okay, right, so this formula is really key. It's the simplest formula for actually calculating GDP, and is the most widely used formula. We have another approach called the income approach, but the income approach is a bit inaccurate in terms of measuring GDP. Why? Because the income approach basically tends to be faulty in the sense that people always underreport their income because they want to pay less taxes. Okay, so the income approach is not a really accurate way of calculating GDP. So we economists tend to stray away from it. Okay, so in that sense, we can actually do a class activity using this simple approach. Okay, and the table below lists the national accounts for the fictional country. Let's call it Madiland. Okay, so we have a couple of data for Madiland, and you guys are economists, and you're supposed to find Madiland's GDP. Okay, so based on the data you have over here, right, and its dollar value, you're supposed to be able to calculate GDP, right? So to calculate GDP, we need to use the expenditure approach. Okay, so we're going to add consumption expenditure to investment to government expenditure and to net exports. Okay, so that is what you should do right now. Add consumption expenditure, investment, government expenditure, and net exports, and let me know what you get. Right, so eventually you're supposed to get 17,000. And 44. Okay, so that's basically $17 trillion. Okay, so that's in billions of dollars, so that's $17 trillion. This is the figure you get. And how do you get this figure? Basically, add consumption expenditure, investment, government expenditure, and net exports together. Okay, so you've been able to find Madiland's GDP. Okay. Now we need to talk about nominal GDP and real GDP. Okay, so GDP has two different forms. We have what we call nominal GDP and we have real GDP, okay? Economists like using real GDP, and the reason is if you take a look at a fictional country, okay? Suppose this fictional country produces 5 oranges, and suppose oranges sell for $2, okay? In this fictional country, suppose this is the only good they produce, oranges, and this is how much they basically sell oranges or each orange, right? Our total GDP in this country is going to be $10, right? But suppose the next year the country is a bit unproductive, maybe the citizens get lazy and they produce only 2 oranges. But maybe due to some supply shock or some demand shock, the prices are really high, okay? So the price is, let's say, $10, right? The price of an orange is $10, right? GDP is going to be $20, okay? So it's going to say, right, looking at the GDP, it's going to say the country has been more productive. But no, the country hasn't been more productive. The country has only been less productive, actually, right? Initially, it was able to produce 5 oranges, and now it's producing only 2 oranges, right? What actually made GDP actually go up, okay, is due to the fact that prices actually increased, okay? So a country could have high inflation and have high GDP, and you think the country is being productive, okay? So that's why we need to look at real GDP and nominal GDP. And like I said earlier, economists will like preferring to use real GDP, okay? Right. So in that sense, real GDP basically looks at the value of final goods and services produced within a country using a certain base period, okay? Using a certain base period known as the reference base period, okay? So basically, all prices are basically sort of referenced to this base year, okay? All prices are basically compared to this base year, right? And currently in the United States, the reference base year is 2009, and generally it's changed almost every 10 years, okay? So real GDP basically uses a base year period, right? It's just trying to see how productivity changes, or it's basically just trying to examine how quantity changes, right? And not necessarily looking at changes in prices, okay? Nominal GDP, on the other hand, looks at the value of goods and services produced in a country, right, using current year prices, okay? So prices that basically prevailed in the same year, okay? So using current year prices, that is how we actually look at nominal GDP, okay? So the difference between real GDP and nominal GDP is that nominal GDP uses prices in the same year, or prices that prevailed in the same year, whilst real GDP uses prices based on some reference year, okay, or a base period, okay? And we'll do an example to actually make more sense of this, okay? So let's look at a fictional country. So we have the fictional country, right? And they produce some items. We have the quantity given, we have the price given, and have the expenditure. So the expenditure, remember I said, is basically related to income, and is basically related to the market value as well, okay? Right, so in this country, if they produce 10 t-shirts, basically the price of each t-shirt, is $5, okay? So the total market value is 10 times 5, which equals 50, okay? The price of each computer chip is basically 10, so then they have 3 computer chips being produced, okay? So the price is 10 for each, so it's 30, right? And security services, right? So they produce 1 security service, the price for 1 is only 20, okay? So this is going to be 20, 30, 50. I remember GDP is the total market value of all goods and services. So basically we add it up and we get our GDP, right? Our real GDP to be basically equal to 100, okay? So real GDP in 2009 basically uses the price in 2009, right? So remember 2009 is the base year, right? So real GDP is always going to use the price in the base year, okay? Nominal GDP, if we look at nominal GDP in 2009, is also going to use the prices in 2009, okay? Right. So nominal GDP is also 100 million, okay? So one thing we can say is that in the base year, real GDP always equals nominal GDP no matter what. Okay, so in the base year, real GDP always equals nominal GDP because basically the years are the same. Okay, the years are essentially the same. Okay, right. And then we have 2016. So this is where it actually gets interesting. Okay, so in 2016, let's calculate nominal GDP. Okay, so what we're trying to calculate is basically nominal GDP. Right, so in 2016, nominal GDP, we're using the price of 2016, right? So you can clearly see the price has changed, okay? So then we have 4 times 5, which equals 20. We have 2 times 20, which equals 40. We have 6 times 40, which equals 240. So nominal GDP in 2016 is basically 300. Okay? Right. Now this is where it gets interesting. How do we find real GDP in 2016? Okay, so real GDP in 2016, remember we said real GDP, to calculate real GDP, you use the quantity or the quantities in 2016 times the price in the base year, okay? Right? So for real GDP, okay, you use the quantities of 2016 valued at a price of 2009. Okay, so the prices basically don't change, right? But the quantities do change. Okay, so you take the quantities in 2016 and use the price in 2009 because you're just looking at the change in quantities over the periods. Okay, so in this sense, it's going to be 4 times 5, right? And then it's going to be 2 times 10. Again, the quantity of computer chips in 2016 times the price of computer chips in 2009. Okay, and then it's going to be 6 times 20. So it's the quantity of security services in 2016 times the price of security services in 2009. And then we get 20, 20, 120. Okay, so real GDP is going to be 160. Okay, so real GDP is basically going to be 160. Again, use the quantities in 2016 related to the prices in the base year. Okay, and we sum these expenditures up, and basically it gives you the real GDP in 2016. Okay, so that is how you find real GDP. Okay, so let's take a look at another example. Okay, at this point, I'll probably ask you to pause the video, right? So you actually see what's going on and try and see if you can actually work out nominal GDP in Desert Kingdom. So Desert Kingdom produces camel rice and dates, right? And we have 2018, which is our base year, and then we have 2019, which is our current year. Okay, so try and find the nominal GDP in Desert Kingdom in 2018 and try and find the real GDP in the Desert Kingdom in 2018 and 2019. Okay, so to find the nominal GDP, let's work through the nominal GDP. Okay, to find the nominal GDP is really simple. You take the quantity, right? So let's find the nominal GDP in 2018. We take the quantity in 2018 times the price in 2018. Okay, so in that sense, it's going to be 50 times 100. Okay, so that's essentially 5,000. And then we have 1 times 1,000, and that's essentially 1,000. So our nominal GDP in 2018 is basically going to be 6,000. Okay, right. To find the nominal GDP in 2019, again, we use the quantity in 2019 times the price in 2019. Okay, so in that sense, it's going to be equal to 120 times 60. And let me just use my calculator real quick. I can't do mental math. So that's 7,200. Okay, and we have 2 times 1,100, and that is 2200. Okay, so our nominal GDP is going to be 9400. Okay, so our nominal GDP in 2018 is 6,000, and our nominal GDP in 2019 is 9400. Now we need to find the real GDP in 2018. Remember, the real GDP in the base year equals the nominal GDP in the base year. So we know that this is going to be 6,000 as well. Okay. But what is the real GDP in 2019? Again, remember, with the real GDP, you use the values or the prices in 2018 corresponding to their quantity in 2019. So you use current year quantity, but you use prices in the base year. Okay, so in that sense, it's going to be 60 times 100, and it's also going to be 1 times 1100. Okay, so 60 times 100 is basically 6,000. Okay, equals 1100, and that should be 7,100. Okay, so real GDP in 2019 is basically 7,100. Okay. Right, so now try and see if you can work through this problem yourself. Try and find the nominal GDP for Tropical Republic in 2018 and 2019, and try and find the real GDP for Tropical Republic in 2018 and basically 2019 as well. Okay, so at this point, I want you to pause the video and just work through it. Okay, so now we should be able to work through this. Okay, so nominal GDP, again, we use prices in the current year times values or quantity in the current year. So it's 2 times 800, so that's 1,600. Should equal 4,000 because that's 10 times 400. Okay, so nominal GDP in that sense is going to be 5,600. Okay, right, and then we can find price, nominal GDP in 2019, so that's price times quantity. So that is 900 times $4, and that is roughly 3,600. Ha, I have to do a quick mental math check there. Okay, and that is gonna be 2,500. So essentially, we have nominal GDP being 6,100 in 2019. Okay, so this is what you're supposed to get. Right, okay. Again, we know that nominal GDP equals real GDP in the base year, so we're still going to get the same figure, so we don't have to worry about the base year too much. It's the same thing as real GDP, is the same thing as nominal GDP. What we need to worry about is real GDP in the current year, okay, which is 2019. Okay, again, we use quantity in 2019, but prices again are fixed to 2018. Okay, so it's going to be quantities of bananas times prices of bananas in 2018, and it's going to be quantities of orange coconuts times price of coconuts in 2018. Okay, right, so we have quantities of bananas in 2019 times price of bananas in 2018, and that is 1,800. Right, and then we have 500, which is quantity of coconuts in 2019 times 10, and that is basically 5,000. So in that sense, real GDP is 6,800. Okay, we have real GDP being 6,800 in this example. Okay, so hopefully that was clear, right? We'll just move on and we look at the uses and limitations of real GDP. I think I'll talk about the uses, and in relation to the limitations, I'll let you guys read on it and I'll ask a discussion question related to that, okay? So the reason we actually want to calculate real GDP is also useful for a couple of things. So it's not necessarily just useful for measuring productivity, but we can actually measure the standard of living over time. And we can also compare the standard of living across countries, okay? So to measure the standard of living over time, or basically to measure how well people are doing in terms of income over time, we use what we call the real GDP per capita, okay? So the real GDP per capita or per person is basically the real GDP divided by the population of a country, okay? Right, so suppose a country has real GDP as 20, and suppose in this country you have only 2 people in it, okay? Real GDP per person is 20 divided by 2, okay? So the real GDP per person is basically $10, okay? Right, so that's how we find real GDP per person. Okay, so real GDP per person basically tells us the value of goods and services that an average person can enjoy. In other words, it's also the value of goods and services that the average, basically it's also the average income of the average person in a country. Okay, so if you take the average person in a country, what is their average income? Well, essentially it's generally equal to the real GDP per person. Okay. So in that sense, we can actually find how the living standards of a country or the living standards for a person in a country generally is, okay? So let's look at the United States. The real GDP per capita, the real GDP per person in the United States as of the second quarter of 2020 is basically 52,387. And as you can tell, and like I said already, we basically in a recession. So you've seen GDP actually fall, right? So it used to be higher than this, right? What this number basically tells us is that the average person in the United States basically earns $52,387 a year. So this is basically, computed annually, right? So that's what that's the average income for the average person in the United States, right? And if you compare it, let's say maybe 20 or 30 years ago, let's go back 30, 40 years, right? GDP per person has actually been increasing, okay? So generally we see a higher trend, a positive trend in terms of real GDP per person, meaning that living standards, right, in the United States actually have been increasing over time, right? The only problem was the fact that we actually had the only problem we currently have is the recession, so it has decreased, right? And to some extent it has decreased close to how GDP per capita was basically like 10 years ago, which is pretty astonishing, right? So incomes have actually fallen, right? But basically this gives us a general idea of how income in the economy is basically moving over time, okay? Right. And some things we need to look out for when we actually look at the long-term trend, right? We need to look out for the growth of potential GDP per person, right? And we need to look at the fluctuations of real GDP around potential GDP. So potential GDP is basically the maximum output or the maximum income a country can basically gain if it employs all its factors of production. So if it's all its resources are basically used, right, the GDP the country can actually produce, okay, is known as potential GDP. Right? And we have this figure or this graph that basically shows potential GDP per person in the United States, right? At least in 2016, we don't have current data yet, right? And this is basically this solid black line. Okay, so this is the real income basically the average person in the United States should earn. if generally all the resources in the United States are basically utilized, okay, right? But due to external economic shocks, right, real GDP per person, which is the actual GDP, basically does not follow the potential GDP per person trend, or basically does not follow the potential GDP per person line, right? So it fluctuates around it, and this is due to some economic shock. It could be an expansion where real GDP per person is actually higher than potential GDP, or it could be a recession where real GDP per person is actually lower than potential GDP. Okay, so generally when potential GDP per person is higher than real GDP per person, we generally tend to have a recession. Okay, the country is not producing enough, and if real GDP per person is higher than potential GDP per person, it means the country is actually overproducing, and you tend to have periods of inflation. Okay, right. So that actually brings us to our next point, which is real GDP fluctuations and the business cycle. Okay, so the business cycle looks at fluctuations of real GDP over time. Okay, so just using the textbook definition, is the irregular up and down movement of total production and other measures of economic activity. Okay, so just looking at the fluctuations or the changes in real GDP over time. Okay, and generally every cycle has two phases. We have the expansion period when the economy is doing great, everything is kumbaya, everything is nice, incomes are rising. Okay, and then you have the recession period where everything is not so great, or everything is not so, nice. Okay, so those are the two phases of the business cycle, expansion and recession. Currently we are actually in a recession. Okay, so that's the phase we are in. And generally, if you're in a recession, the good thing about recession is that you always get out at some point and eventually go into an expansion. Okay, and then we have two turning points, which is basically the peak, and we have what we call the trough, right? So we can actually look at a couple of figures. Okay, and this figure basically illustrates the business cycle. Okay, so the expansion is basically when you have economic boom. Okay, so it's a period there in which real GDP increases, generally from a trough to a peak. Okay, so you have a trough right over here, right? The lowest point during a recession is a trough, and then you have a peak, right? So this point to, let's say, this point, right, before there was a dip, you can basically call it an expansion. Okay, so a peak is the turning point before a recession happens, and the trough is basically the turning point before an expansion happens. Okay, and a recession is generally the period when real GDP decreases at least for two successive quarters, right? And it's generally between the peak and the trough. Okay, so this shaded area, which is right over here, is basically a recession. Okay, it's basically a recession when GDP actually is falling and falls over two consecutive quarters. Okay, so now let's look at some real world data. Let's look at data in the United States. Okay, so you can basically see moments where there was a peak. So let's take a look at the financial recession, for example. Right, there was a peak right here. Okay, so P for peak. And then there was a trough right here. That was the lowest point of the GDP. So let's call it T. And this period in between, the shaded area, is basically the recession. Okay. And then generally from the trough to another peak, let's say to this point, because you have little fluctuations, but it wasn't too bad. Let's say to this point, because we actually have a recession. So we can actually use this as a good example, right? So we had a peak here. Right, so this whole area is basically an economic expansion. So the economic was booming, it was expanding, it was moving towards an upward trend. Okay, and then you have currently what we have in a recession right now. Okay, so that is how a peak and a trough looks like. And basically a peak and a trough are the turning points of the business cycles, right? So a peak turns into a recession because you get to a peak and then you fall. And then the trough is the lowest point of the recession where you get to that point and then you bounce back up. Okay. Right. And then we also said we can use GDP to compare living standards across country. But there are a few problems that arise. When this happens. Okay. Right. Because GDP is measured in the market value, right? And market value, basically you have to quote things in prices, and every country has different prices. At the same time, every country basically uses different currencies. So how do you compare the yen to the dollar? How do you compare the Canadian dollar to the Mexican peso, for example, right? Different countries have different prices, and also they have different currencies, right? So that's the major problem that happens when you actually trying to compare GDP across countries, okay? And like we said, goods and services in both countries must be valued at the same price, okay? So whatever the cost is for a Big Mac in Mexico should be the same cost for a Big Mac in the United States. But due to currency differences, this isn't always the case. It's always problematic to actually compare real GDP between countries, right? Usually what happens is that the real GDP between countries is actually converted to sort of like a common currency, which is usually the US dollar, in order to actually compare the living standards between countries. But that actually depends on the exchange rates and might not tell you the whole picture, okay? So this basically ends our chapter 4. I will urge you guys to read Limitations of Real GDP. There'll be a discussion question on it, right? Why might real GDP or GDP itself not be the best measure of economic welfare in a country? Yeah, you need to basically answer that question, all right? And we'll move from there, okay? So this ends our chapter 4. And next time we'll see you in chapter 5, where we'll talk about inflation and unemployment. Thank you.